There we go. The plan now is to finish up a little bit that we didn't finish about the topic of Aleinu. And then after that, it's on to a new adventure of Kabbalat Shabbat, which is interesting because I've never really, to be very honest, never really taken the time to think about it too much. So we'll talk a little bit tonight about the background of Kabbalat Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat is not I would not call it an ancient part of the liturgy. And so where did it come from? What were they trying to do by, well, first of all, we have to identify who is the they, and what were they trying to do by instituting Kabbalat Shabbat. And then what we'll do is systematically go through each of the paragraphs of Kabbalat Shabbat, which is really a study in Tehillim until you get to L'Chadodi. And try to understand why these were selected as part of Kabbalat Shabbat. So we'll sort of study them in their pure sense as chapters of Tehillim, and then understand, try to put ourselves in the mindset of those who instituted Kabbalat Shabbat, and understand why these over time were the chosen paragraphs of Kabbalat Shabbat. That's where we're going. That's the roadmap. So, okay, fine. So without further ado, let me share with you on the screen. And again, if you're not on the email, like a group of emails that I've over the few years I've been teaching here, I've sort of put together people who are interested in the Tefillah classes. If you're not on it, please let me know. I'm happy, because then you can get an advanced copy of the source sheet in case you prefer to print it out. And you can also, again, follow along on the screen. So we spoke about, towards the end of last week, we spoke about the two different paragraphs of Aleinu and how they, on the surface, seem to be very much focused on different polar opposites they're just, one is a focus more about our relationship with God, and we are distinct compared to other nations of the world. That was the first paragraph. And then there's the second paragraph of Al Kain Nikave Lecha, this idea that we hope to see one day, essentially, God is reigning over the world. And they're both beautiful, but they're not really connected so tightly. So we tried at the end of last week to make that connection. So I'll reread a little bit from what we read last week in Rabbi Bick's take on this, on Aleinu, and then we'll push forward to parts that we didn't see, and hopefully put a bow on our discussion of Aleinu. So we'll back up here a little bit. This is a little bit of a review. So we saw what the Chatam Sofer pointed out with regards to these two sections of Aleinu, and that they are actually opposites. Right here, right over here, but again, I'm in source number 11. Sorry, just moved the mouse by mistake. The first celebrates Jewish distinctiveness. The first paragraph of Aleinu celebrates Jewish distinctiveness and exclusivity, while the second aspires to universal acceptance of God. That is exactly the point of Al Kain. We must praise and thank God for enabling us to be the people for whom He is King. But therefore, and precisely therefore, because we have this unique relationship, we are charged with carrying that message to the entire world. Now, to dream and aspire for a world in which He will be king over all, and where, quote, He will be one and His name is one. That's the end of Aleinu. Hashem Echad U'Shemo Echad. Now, again, last week, I think it was Alan who pointed out, well, always in the paragraph, God is really the one who is we're asking Him L'Takein Olam Melchut Shagai. But I would say a lot of times in Tefillah, as we've seen over the few years studying, I feel more comfortable saying this, and I'm not saying this al regel achat, that are sort of standing on one leg, but we've seen oftentimes that the Tefillot that we address to God are in some ways, yes, they're addressed to God, but they're oftentimes things that we're also charging ourselves with improving in certain areas, or things that we want to have happen, and oftentimes those come down to us. And and I think we've really spoken about this at length over the last couple of years. The idea that God's presence in this world, to the extent that He is King, He's only King. He's King. That doesn't need our approval, but He's only King insofar as His subjects acknowledge Him as King. That's just the reality. Okay. Then he continues here and says the Chatam Sofer explains this as deriving from the experience of the God of the love of God. Because we love God, we cannot accept a situation in which only we recognize Him. Okay, and we point out here parenthetically that Rav Chestai Kreskas writes that it is characteristic of the love of God that it leads to a passionate desire to call others to join in the love. Again, I point out this is something something you love, a Dvar Torah that you love, you heard an amazing whatever, and we all have lists like this, by the way. Whether it's a Dvar Torah or other things we love to share with other people, there's like a certain group of people, or it's a WhatsApp group that you're in, of interesting things. Like, I have to share this with you. And that's the same idea here. We have this special relationship with God, and we understand what living a godly life means by studying the Torah, and we want to spread that through our actions and through who we are to the rest of the world. Hopefully, as a people, we're inspiring everybody. Now, that sounds like a large goal that's almost unattainable, but I remind you of the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that it's not for us to necessarily finish the job, but it's also not on us to ignore. We can't be mevatel. We can't say, well, if I can't get the job done, well, then I shouldn't bother at all. It's our job to continuously try to meet this goal, even if it seems unattainable on a just cognitive level. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be aiming for it. He writes here, though, right? It continues, and still there's a bit of tension between the two parts, until one views it in light of the Bach's explanation. Right? We saw the Bach last week. I'll just remind you, the Bach, Rav Yoel Sirkis, he had written that Aleinu is supposed to be said in order to entrench in our hearts before we leave our houses of worship, or maybe our houses if we're living at home, and we have to strengthen in our hearts emunah, faith, our faith in the kingship of God, that He's going to remove idols from the earth, and all the other gods are essentially going to be struck down in order to perfect the world in that way. That people will essentially, by virtue of the fact that there are no other idols and other gods, people will come to recognize God. But we have to strengthen this in our hearts, because when we go out, we don't want to have chas v'shalom shum hirhur avera, that we want to get tempted into things in the world that are counter to the ways of God. So that's just reminding you what the Bach said. So now with that in mind, we are not celebrating Jewish distinctiveness for its own sake. We are going out into the world, and that is only permissible and justified if it is accompanied by the understanding of the greatness of the mission. Litakein olam b'malchut shakai, right? To perfect the world, of the kingship of God. That it should be under the kingship of God. We can leave the sanctuary of the service of God only if first we understand that the life of sanctity we experience in the synagogue, the service of God, our King, is radically different than what we will meet outside. And secondly, that we can leave the sanctuary only in order to bring the service of God with us. That's why we leave. Why do we have to entrench it in our hearts, according to the Bach? Right? The point is that if we don't, then who's to say that we should be going out there and becoming enticed by all sorts of ideas that are counter to our faith and to what God, and to what God stands for. So the point of going out there is actually, of saying Aleinu, is to entrench this in us, so that when we go out there into the world, we're bringing the service of God with us. We leave the sacred precincts because we are carrying a consignment, a mission, not to join the world and descend to its level, but to raise it to ours and to work for its transformation. That's the job of the Jewish people. That's the job that Avraham had. Right? Transform the world. Transform it to be a better place, a place of righteousness and justice. We're the descendants of Avraham. That's our mission. Aleinu is not only a prophylactic to the dangers of the world, but a charge and a mission, a charge and mission to make the world the kingdom of God. That's our job, and it's God's kingdom only if people see that it's God's kingdom. If they acknowledge it's God's kingdom, and that can only happen through our actions. Right? God, yes, God split the sea, and there are other miraculous stories we read in Tanakh. The world, for whatever reason, we don't have those types of nature suspending types of moments. And so really it comes down to God's creations. And particularly, it's the descendants of Avram have this mission in particular, though anyone can pick up the mantle and do this as well. But it's our particular mission to make the world see the kingdom of God, that this is God. God is really supreme in this world. Hence, he writes, Al Kain. Al Kain, that's why it's a therefore. Since we are the inhabitants of the kingdom of God, as exemplified in our prayer, and standing in the house of the king, therefore, Al Kain, when we go out, it is with the dream, the hope, and the mission of advancing the vision of the world of the king, when all flesh shall call on your name. Only thus is it permitted for God's people to wander about the secular world. Again, it's not to say, I don't want to speak for Rabbi Bick. I would say that this is not to say that everything about the secular world is puzzle. It's invalid. Hahefech. That's not the case. There is so much that when you see out there in the world, I'll give you an example. So there's a halacha called chukot hagoyim, that we're not supposed to emulate the ways of the nations of the world. When is that halacha applicable? When essentially that practice is like, we would say it's nourishkeit. So an example, what's oftentimes is cited as a problem of chukot hagoyim is celebrating something like Halloween. Okay? Because what is it? It doesn't have any logical, positive idea behind it. But when is it not chukot hagoyim? There could be other things we've borrowed. I'll give you an example. When the rabbi gets up to give a drasha on Shabbos, do you know the origins of giving a sermon in the middle of a synagogue service? It's not of Jewish origin. That is a fundamentally Christian thing that crept its way into Jewish services, probably maybe into the other denominations of non-Orthodox denominations first, and then it spread. Now, do we say it's chukot hagoyim? You can't give a sermon in the middle of the services, because our ancestors didn't do that. 500 years ago, they didn't give sermons in the middle of the service. The answer is it's not chukot hagoyim. Number one, because we all do it all the time, so that's how we know, number one. And number two, we also know it's not the case because, it serves a positive function. It makes sense when something is rational and we can learn from it and adds to our experience. Of course it's permissible. So it's my way of saying that there are going to be things out there in the secular world that are incredible. Another example, I think I've given a class on this in the Night of Learning. I think I did this once at the community program. It was at Beth El, and maybe I did it in the shul once too. But the whole idea of a Seder, Chazal's idea of having a Seder on Pesach, that we all sit around and we talk about a subject while we're leaning on couches and everything, that's very Roman. That's how they used to have a Greco-Roman symposium. But Chazal, and that's my whole thing in that shir is about the afikomen. Afikomen means after dinner revelry, because in those days, the Greco-Roman symposium, they would end up having all the party, what would start out with like drushas and speaking about philosophy would turn into a situation of debauchery, and it would be terrible. So what do the Jewish people, what do Chazal say? I love this part of it. That's great. Sit around, talk about a text, talk about a story, engage in it, be mesaper b'yetziat Mitzrayim, but don't do afikomen. Afikomen really used to mean this after party crazy, after dinner craziness. And that's not a Jewish thing. The idea of getting drunk and of engaging in all sorts of immoral behaviors, that's not okay. So you see, even Chazal, in the way they built the Seder on Pesach night, you see that they were influenced by the kind of learning that was going around them in the secular world, but they took the parts of it that made sense. Now, and I also would add here that when we say it's permitted to wander about the secular world, it also doesn't mean like, oh, we just take from the secular world. I don't buy into that concept. Oh, this is okay, so we can take that. Our job, as you see here, is actually really to be contributing. A Jew should be contributing to the world. That should be the mission. That should be the mantra of modern Orthodoxy. Why is it that we're so engaged with the world? Because we're there to inspire the world, to contribute to the world, to be the ones who are at the forefront of science and technology and medicine and to making the world, a step closer to a better place. That's all.
Yeah, there seems to be a contradiction here, though.
Please, yes.
That last sentence says, only thus is it permitted for God's people to wander about the secular world. But if you look at the rest of the paragraph, it seems to be saying that we are commanded to go out into the world and influence it. So are we permitted or are we commanded to?
Yeah, it's a good point. I would say, and I don't want to speak for Rabbi Bick, he's writing it's permitted, meaning that if you didn't have the first part, he's saying it's only permitted. Yeah, I think maybe we could say it even stronger. Maybe that we're commanded to, right? We're commanded to be doing this. I agree with you, Alan. I agree with you that I think that makes sense. Yeah, I'm not sure why he used the word permitted. Maybe he had there was something he had in mind there, but I don't think that's a crazy leap to say not just from permitted, but that it's our obligation to do this. I mean, I think that's what Al-Kain actually implies. Therefore, X needs to happen, and we need to make that happen. Okay, let's continue here. Almost done here. So he writes that the process whereby Rabbi Bix writes here, the process whereby Aleinu moves from Rosh Hashanah prayer to every day represents an amazing transformation. Yeah, as we pointed out, I think it was last time, Aleinu was not originally in the daily tefillah. When it was initially in the daily tefillah, it was only in Shacharit, and then it became the Arizal, Rav Isaac Luria. That's when it became every tefillah. But it was the Jewish community kind of made this transformation from Rosh Hashanah to every day. So Al-Kain envisions a day when God will reign totally over the entire world. Placing it at the beginning of the special section of Musaf on Rosh Hashanah makes sense, obviously. We're talking about the kingship of God. Rosh Hashanah is the day of Malchut, the day when we crown God as king. Moving Aleinu to a daily recitation is taking it from the inner sanctum, from the throne room of God, as it were, to the mundane street, to a daily experience, without the majestic glory of the holiest of holies. But that is precisely the point. We are commanded to export the majesty of God from the inner sanctum, from the esoteric confines of a secret society. Oh, we only see it on Rosh Hashanah. Nobody knows about that. This is the secret mission. God will become king one day, and everyone will see it over the whole world. He's king, but everyone will recognize him as king. Right? The Jewish people moved it to every day, to every time they leave the sanctuary to venture into the world, because that is the true message of being a member of the people of God. Since we have been favored and chosen to be the bearers of his name, we hope and pray and wait for the day when his name will be honored at every intersection, when every inhabitant of the world will know and recognize that to you shall bend every knee and swear every tongue. That's from Aleinu. We know that it is true when we are in the we know that it is true when we are in the synagogue of Rosh Hashanah. But we must continue to let that message imbue our every breath, precisely when we are walking in the street of a desecrated world. In the synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, Aleinu is a statement of fact. God is king. Everybody in this building knows it. That's why you showed up today. That's why you showed up on Rosh Hashanah. Because we know God is king. Otherwise, why did we come? However, at the door when leaving the synagogue on a regular weekday, it is a song of triumph and dedication to the ultimate transformation of the world to what should be. Okay, it's not that we're declaring this in the confines and the privacy of our home, but we're now charging ourselves with a mission. And perhaps that's why this was instituted by the Jewish people as over time, the medieval period has crept into the text, right? That this was for us to learn from every single day as we go out into the world to understand the kingship of God and how important that is. And what are we going to do about that vis-a-vis the rest of the world? Somebody chatted me. That's why the melody of Aleinu has to be different Rosh Hashanah. Excellent point. And that brings me to my next thing. But yes, and if you remember, by the way, Alan was the one who typed that in the chat box, if I'm not mistaken. The Arizal, as quoted by the Aruch HaShulchan, said you have to every day you have to sing Aleinu. You got to sing it. It's got to be upbeat and joyous. And on Rosh Hashanah, it's more like God is king, and we're kind of trembling in our boots, and you can tell that from the melody. That's correct. Aleinu. It's very serious. So I love that. Great point about Chazanut as capturing what we're supposed to be feeling. Okay, take a look here. Just want to really drive the point home. This is an Orach Chaim. As I mentioned before, the Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Karo never mentions that this idea of you're supposed to say Aleinu at the end of Tefillah every day. Right? All he writes is Asur la'adam la'tzeit beit haKnesset kodem kedusha desidra. You're not allowed to leave before Uvalat Sion. Right? You have to stay through that. But he doesn't mention Aleinu. It's the Ramah who says Omrim achar siyum haTefillah. Notice those key words here. He says we say after the conclusion of Tefillah. Davening is over. Aleinu is not davening anymore. That's when we say Aleinu l'shabeach, and we say it me'umad. We say it standing up. Okay. All right. Fine. Now, so again, that just drives home the point. Aleinu is really not part of Tefillah. It's the part after Tefillah. Let's finish up. Last thing here from Rabbi Bick. It is, in other words, we're talking about Aleinu here, the anthem of the believing servant of God. Standing on the banks of the Jordan, remember that whole theory, remember I said we're going to come back to it. Yehoshua, why they even if Yehoshua didn't write this, they attributed it to Yehoshua in medieval Ashkenaz. Right? The Kolbo said that's the tradition I keep hearing. So much so Aruch HaShulchan, years and years later, reports that this is maybe the source of it. Standing on the banks of the Jordan, about to set out on the great mission of creating the people of God in the land of Israel, fearful and hopeful, Yehoshua recites Aleinu. It is the battle cry of a movement to establish the world as the kingdom of God. The first paragraph, Aleinu, states who we are. Second commits us to what we stand for and to what we are dedicated. Now, I will point out, though, that dedication was a bunch of wars that Yehoshua was going to fight. They crossed the Jordan, and there was a lot of war. Their making God king over the world required them to go to war with certain nations that God had identified in Sefer Dvarim as basically so corrupt and so against the ways of God that they needed to be defeated. I don't suggest that we go out in the world and attempt anything close to that. I think let's kill them with kindness. I think that's a better way to go in terms of inspiring the world as to the ways of God. It is important to understand the particular flavor of the kingdom of God described in Al Kain Nikaveh. On Rosh Hashanah, there is a Malchuyot prayer recited at the start of the Amidah, beginning with the words, And thus Hashem, our God, place your fear on all of your creation. Okay, it calls for the majesty of God to overwhelm the world. There should be fear on everyone who is created, culminating in the hope that all of evil shall disappear like smoke. Or in a more terrifying version, all of evil shall disappear in smoke. That is not, however, the Malchuyot that is chosen for the middle section of the Amidah. Okay, there we recite Al Kain Nikaveh, focusing not on the overpowering of evil or its destruction, but on a vision of all flesh shall call on your name, to turn towards you all the evil of the earth. Everyone should turn towards God. That every knee shall bend to you, every tongue shall swear. For you they shall bow and fall, and to the glory of your name shall they give honor. And all shall accept the yoke of your kingdom, and you shall reign over speedily and forever. It is this vision, that was all a quote from Aleinu, by the way. It is this vision, the unification of all in the service of God, the elimination of the separation, we joyfully praised at the beginning of Aleinu. At night, we don't want there to be we are distinct and they are not. We don't want that. We want the whole world, everybody, to feel the way that we do, right? To have that relationship with God, to feel what it means to follow in the ways of God and to live that kind of a life. You know, if they're not Jewish, by the way, but they're following in the precepts of, that Avraham stood for. Right? Avraham lived before there was a Torah. He had there's a godly way to live, even if you're not Jewish. That's, I think, what we're talking about here. That is the anthem of the Jew in the world. It is not my mission to see the fear and terror of God overwhelming the world. It is my mission to call and encourage all flesh to turn and accept the kingdom of God. And as is written at the end of there, on that day, please God, shall God be one, and his name be one. Stop the screen share there for a moment. Questions, comments, ideas? Okay. Well, then we'll continue, if there are none. Again, feel free to jump in. I think it really helps, for me, I think it really helps frame Aleinu in terms of why it's there in the Tefillah, the inspiring message of Aleinu being the conclusion of Tefillah every day. And I hope that that's something we all think about as we head into the world every single day after we say it in the morning, and even as we say it the rest of the time, for Mincha and Mariv, as we leave the presence of God, whether it's davening in our home or it's davening in shul, that when we continue on with the rest of our day, that our mission should be to make the world see the kingship of God. How that happens, well, I'll let you all figure that out in your own life, how you're going to make that happen. But that should be the focus of a Jew going out into the world. Okay. So no questions on that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a different screen now. And we're going to transition to talking about Kabbalat Shabbat. Kabbalat Shabbat has some interesting origins. Very interesting origins, to be very frank. Kabbalat Shabbat is comprised of there are 6 chapters of Tehillim, followed by the song, the poetry of Lichadodi. Lichadodi, as you can tell if you carefully look at the letters in Lichadodi, you can tell who the author was, and that author was Shlomo Alkabetz. And we'll talk a little bit more about him tonight and next week as well. And that poem that he wrote of Lichadodi still plays a central role in Kabbalat Shabbat services around the world. That is the highlight of Kabbalat Shabbat. It is singing Lichadodi, and I acknowledge, by the way, singing Lecha Dodi. They never, we'll talk more about this. There was never an intent that you should say Lecha Dodi. You should sing Lecha Dodi. That means even if you were by yourself, the original author of this never imagined, I think, that you would just say it. And then after that, there are two more paragraphs of Tehillim. Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat, Psalm 92, and then there's Hashem Malach that follows afterwards. So it's mostly Psalms, but then this song Lecha Dodi, which is certainly the crescendo of Kabbalat Shabbat, which is the last moments before we accept Shabbat formally, at least with words, even if, let's say, by it's in the summertime, where Shabbat doesn't start yet, by the fact that the sun hasn't gone down behind the set behind the horizon. You can accept Shabbat right after Lecha Dodi by saying Mizmor Shir Liyom HaShabbat. That's a verbal acceptance of the Shabbat day. So let's start by looking at a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. This is undoubtedly the inspiration for Kabbalat Shabbat. No question, this is the inspiration for Kabbalat Shabbat. I think it's almost pretty explicitly mentioned by those who were responsible for Kabbalat Shabbat becoming part of the liturgy. Now, I'm also being very vague about who the they are so far. And Shlomo Alkabetz is part of that group, and these were Kabbalists. Let's be very frank. Kabbalat Shabbat has Kabbalistic roots, and really probably traces back to Tzfat in the 16th century, probably latter portions of the 16th century, when this becomes, in some form, there's a Kabbalat Shabbat, and then there's there's some additional parts that were added. It was not all at one fell swoop that Kabbalat Shabbat came together. But let's first read this Gemara to be able to appreciate what we're talking about. This is from Masechet Shabbat, Kuf Yud Tet Amud Aleph, 119a. The Gemara here is going through a series of statements that are attributed to the Amoraim, the rabbis of the time in the time of the Gemara. What would they do to show Oneg Shabbat, to have like a delight in Shabbat, or as they write here in the commentary, a deference to Shabbat? What were some special things that some of the Amoraim, the rabbis in the Talmud, were doing for Shabbat? So let's read. Rabbi Chanina mi'atef v'koi apanya dema'ale Shabta. Amar bo v'netze likrat Shabbat hamalka. Rabbi Chanina would wrap himself, mi'atef, right? And he would wrap himself in his garment, usually, again, not necessarily his talit, though it wouldn't be, he put some sort of cloak on himself, something that was special for Shabbat. And he was standing there. He's facing there. Dema'ale Shabta. Ma'ale Shabta means Erev Shabbat. He's standing there as Shabbat is coming in. Okay, he wrapped himself in some garment and he's standing. It sounds like he's outside. He's sort of standing there as the sun is setting, as Shabbat is entering in. And what does he say? Come, let us go out to greet the Shabbat queen. Come and let us go out. We will go out and greet the Shabbat queen. And what happened? Rabbi Yanai. So that's what Rabbi Chanina did. Rabbi Yanai, what would he do? Lavesh ma'ane me'olu umikase. Rabbi Yanai put on his garment on Erev Shabbat, and then he cloaked himself in his garment, and he said, Boi kala, boi kala. Come, or enter my bride, enter, O bride. Now, this already is obvious how the connection, I think, to Kabbalat Shabbat. Boi chala, that is the line at the very end of Lecha Dodi, when we all turn around and we literally greet the Shabbat queen. Right? Well, where did that come from? This Gemara is the source idea of the Shabbat queen. Okay, that we're greeting the Shabbat queen. We're saying boi kala. Let's go and read the. This is most certainly the source. By the way, just so you see here, it's really kind of this little thing is placed in the middle of a whole Gemara talking about what all these rabbis were doing. Just to give you a sense, what were some of the other ones doing? Rabbi Bar Rav Huna, what was his special thing for Shabbat? He happened to come to the house of Rabbi Bar Rav Nachman. They brought before him 3 se'ah, it's a measurement of oiled biscuits. That was like a special treat from the bakery, basically. He said to them, wow, did you know I was coming and you prepared all these biscuits for my honor? You made special Shabbat biscuits? And to which they said to him, he said, we love you. We love you, Rabbi Bar Rav Huna. But are you more important to us than Shabbat? We made the biscuits because it's Shabbat, not because you came. It's Shabbos. That's why I made the biscuits. Just to point out here, you see, the rabbis were doing all sorts of special things for Shabbat. That was they wanted to do something special for Shabbat. So in this middle of this section, you have some rabbis, Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yanai, who have this custom and this tradition. It's not a halacha, but they would go out and they would literally greet Shabbat as the sun was setting behind the horizon. This was what they were doing on Friday evening. So now the Rambam, when he talks about bringing the Shabbat, so what does he say? There's no Kabbalat Shabbat in the days of the Rambam. There was no Kabbalat Shabbat Tefillah. What would they do in davening wise? They said Mariv. It was nothing out of the ordinary. So take a look here. He says, the Rambam says, Ezehu kavod, what is meant by honoring Shabbat? How do you honor Shabbat? So I'll read it in English just for purposes of time. The sages explain this by declaring that each person should wash his face, hands, and feet with hot water on Friday in honor of the Shabbat. Right? There's a mitzvah to take a shower or a bath on Friday. Chap the mitzvah, by the way. When you're taking the shower, it's great, it's a mitzvah. It's a way of kavod Shabbat. We're fulfilling the mitzvah of kavod Shabbat. We are cleaning ourselves. So we come into Shabbat feeling, our best selves. Now, this may be a little bit lost on us. They didn't bathe or shower quite as frequently, I think, as we do today. So the idea of bathing with hot water on a Friday was like, that's a big thing. You're getting yourself ready for something very special. And then what should you do? Umit atef b'tzitzit. Interesting. He talks about wrapping himself in something. You wrap yourself in tzitzit and be seated v'yoshev v'koved rosh miyachel hakbalat pedei hashabbat, and almost meditate. The Rambam is suggesting sit down. Koved rosh is like with a sort of serious attitude. And, this idea of the expectation of entering in and receiving the Shabbat, kemoshu yotzei likrat hamelach, the same way that you would go to greet a king. I don't know what to do with this, by the way, but the Rambam switched it from queen to king here. Okay? The Chachamim Harishonim, some of the early sages, what would they do? The Rambam points out this Gemara, not by name, but he says, Hayu mekabtzin talmidehem be'erev Shabbat. They would gather their students on Erev Shabbat, on Friday afternoon as the sun is going slowly behind the horizon. Umit atfim, they would put on their nice Shabbat clothing. Ve'omrim bo'u v'neitzei likrat Shabbat hamelech. Come, let us go out and meet the Shabbat king. Again, I don't know what to do with the fact that the Rambam switched it because the Gemara is very clear. Same words, except that it became Malka, became Melech here. I don't know. I have no drush out here what to make of that. The Rambam switched it. But we should go out and greet the Shabbat king. So there is already, the Rambam is mentioning there's this ancient custom of, putting on your Shabbat clothing and saying we're going to greet the Shabbat king. But he doesn't mention here going outside and this. That's not yet mentioned here. Okay, the Rambam sounds like really the best way to greet Shabbat is quietly. the Koved Rosh, you know, taking it in, breathing in right now. It's about to be Shabbat. And what does that mean? Okay, that's almost the way I picture the way the Rambam is framing this. Just to point out, later in the same parak in Hilchot Shabbat, this is chapter 30, Halacha Bet, Halacha Vav, Halacha 6, he writes, even if, just to point out how important the mitzvah of Kabbalat Shabbat is, that we do something actively, he writes, even a person of high rank who does not, as a rule, buy things at the market or engage in household chores, presumably, by the way, because they have a servant who does it. So they send their servant or their worker, you go buy it for me at the market, you go do the household, you'll sweep up before Shabbat, right? The Rambam writes, this person should perform what is necessary for Shabbat. For this is the way of showing respect. So you can't ask somebody else to sweep up before Shabbat, clean off the table before Shabbat. We need to do that ourselves. Some of the ancient sages used to chop wood for the cooking. Others used to cook or salt meat or twine wicks or light lamps. Others used to go out and buy food and drinks for Shabbat. Although none of them would usually do these things on the weekdays. If you ask them to go out to the grocery store on Tuesday and get a pack of a bottle of a bottle of wine, say, so and so can get it. I'll send one of my talmidim to do it. No. When it comes to Shabbat, though, on Friday, we're supposed to do it ourselves. That's the mitzvah. The more anyone honors b'chol hamar bedavar zeh harei zeh mishubach. The more you do this, and you use your hands to prepare for Shabbat, the more praiseworthy that person's act, that person is. Harei zeh mishubach. Now, this Gemara that we saw in Masechet Shabbat, as I mentioned before, is undoubtedly the beginnings of where Kabbalat Shabbat gets its inspiration from. But to really fully appreciate the people who were involved in instituting Kabbalat Shabbat and really being the inspiration for it, becoming so popular, and again, I believe we can trace it to Tzfat in Israel in the late 16th century. We have to understand who the key figures and who the key players were in Tzfat. And there are two very important figures at the beginning. There's an aliyah that happens from of two particular gedolim, and this may be the beginnings of understanding what was behind Kabbalat Shabbat. So this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think hopefully it helps us appreciate the people behind Kabbalat Shabbat. So this is a little bit lengthy, and I'm a little bit short on time. So we'll do a little bit now, and maybe we'll review next time. This is from a work called the Shnei Luchot Habrit. Anyone know what we call that? Often we shorten that. The work called the Shnei Luchot Habrit.
The Shlach.
Yeah, good. The Shla, right? The Shla.
Oh, the Shla. Sorry, the Shla. Right.
Yeah. Lamed Hey Shla. So the full name of the work is called the Shnei Luchot Habrit. The Shla was Rav Horowitz. I think his name was Yeshayahu Horowitz, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I got that right. So he writes a kind of a halachic compendium. It's really talks about the things we're supposed to do in different aspects of halacha. So here is from his writings on the laws of Shavuot. What do we do on Shavuot? And so actually, there's a paragraph here, paragraph 13, and he says, and he's reporting, what is it you're supposed to learn on the night of Shavuot? This is probably one of the earliest sources we have for the idea of staying up on Shavuot, and there's some sort of seder of what we're supposed to learn. And just give you a sense here, he says he says we stay up on Leil Shavuot, and we sort of wipe away sleep from our eyes, And what are we supposed to do? This is what I instituted, for the night of Shavuot, what people should learn. So he starts with a little bit of Bereshit, and you can read the list to yourself here. I don't want to go through because it's a little bit of a diversion from what we're doing, but you see different parts of the Torah and of Nevi'im and Ketuvim that he suggests that are studied on the night of Shavuot when you're staying up all night. And then after you're done with the parts of Tanakh, he says, study the Mishnah from Zroim, and then probably by then it'll be morning time. So, it's this is enough, by the way, to keep you up all night. And I don't know if you'll really finish. And then by the way, okay, fine. So that's what you're supposed to do. Now, he then says, where is this here? Take a look here. Where did he get this list from? I'm going to go back a little bit. Source number 5. He says, "Ulaharaot gedulat ma'alat zot halayla." You want me to show you? The Shlah says how incredible and how powerful Shavuot night is, and how important it is to stay up on Shavuot. Eich shechaviv lifnei Hakadosh Baruch Hu. How much God loves the people who stay up on Shavuot. He says, "Livil tini dom rega achat mitveku Torah." They don't even want to, have one moment of sleep or, anything. They want to just cleave to the Torah. Gam yesh reshut lahafsik be'in le'inyan l'divrei l'davar divrei hitorit musar u'pishpush ma'asim l'takein takanot lirat Hashem. How important it is on Shavuot night. You can take breaks to talk about musar and to talk about how to be better people and to think about, our actions and how we can fix them. And great. So I want to show you how important Shavuot is. I want to tell you a story that happened not that long ago. Michtav hamekubal harav Rabbeinu Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz. That's the author of Lechadodi. Okay? A story that was written in a letter from the Mekubal, the Kabbalist, Rav Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz. Shaya mitchaber bebayit shel Rabbeinu Beit Yosef. He was together with, who's the Beit Yosef?
Karo.
You have Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, who, by the way, was also a big Mekubal, a big Kabbalist. V'hofia alav ruach hakodesh. And on that night, he writes in this letter, Rav Shlomo Alkabetz writes in this letter that they had some sort of divine encounter. Okay, sorry, it was the out of order part here. What was the divine encounter? And he's talking about what were they doing? They're learning. And suddenly, let me find it here. This is the report of what happened. There they had this whole list of things that they were learning. Rav Shlomo Alkabetz, we were learning. Me and Rav Yosef Karo, we were learning Bechavrusa, all these things. And then we got to learning, the Mishnah. So we got two Masechtas in, and something happened. Zikanu Borenu. We merited from our Creator. V'nishma et kol hamedaber. God's voice started to talk to us. B'fi hachasid, through the mouth of the Chassid, Natra Rachmane Uparke. May his may God be merciful and guard him mercifully. The merciful one should guard him and redeem him. Kol gadol b'chituch otiot. Suddenly, out of Rav Yosef Karo's mouth started coming all sorts of things that were clearly coming from God. It was like God was talking through Rav Yosef Karo. And he's got all sorts of this great, powerful voice. The Chol Hashchainim, all the neighbors, Hayu Shomim, they heard something was coming out of Rav Yosef Karo's mouth. V'lo mevinim, they didn't understand what he was saying. And it was getting stronger and stronger. We fell on our faces. We couldn't even look at him because it was basically like the divine presence was almost resting on his every words that was coming out of him. And what did God say? Now, I can't go through the whole thing here. This is, first of all, it's fascinating because this becomes a big source for staying up at night. You see, because God came to Rav Yosef Karo through his words, and he appeared to us, as it were. We had a little bit of Ruach, Rav Yosef Karo, a little Ruach HaKodesh, says Rav Shlomo Alkabetz. But what's key here? Take a look. God keeps saying a few different things. Chizku v'imtzu b'ahavat v'torati u'v'yirati. You should continue to love my Torah, loving me and my Torah and my great. And then he said, "Chazar v'amar." This is the bold part here towards the bottom. Chazar v'amar. God, the voice kept saying, "Ashreichem banai, shuvu elimudeichem." Fortunate are my children. Go back to your studies. V'al tafsika. One more thing. V'al tafsika rega. Don't waste a moment. And by the way, v'alu le'eretz Yisrael. Make aliyah. Remember, they're living in Sephardic lands, and Rav Yosef Karo is not living in Israel yet. And he says, God, this heavenly inspiration said, make aliyah. Make aliyah. What happened? Lachein. Second to the last line here. Maharu v'alu ki ani hamit parneset lachem v'ani afarneschem. God said, quickly, make aliyah. I will take, I am the person who will take care of your parnasa. I'm going to take care of it. You go, well, how am I going to move? It's not easy to make aliyah. I don't have a job yet in Israel. This divine voice through Rav Yosef Karo said, I will find, don't worry, I'll take care of the parnasa. I'll take care of your finances. Just make aliyah. And apparently, this was the inspiration behind Rav Yosef Karo and Rav Shlomo Alkabetz to making aliyah to Israel when they moved to Tzfat. Is this true? Is it not? Did this story happen the way that's being reported by Rav Shlomo Alkabetz? Remember, the Shlomo is just copying over the letter that Rav Shlomo Alkabetz had written it about this incident. So it's a weird way to leave off the night because we have much more to cover about this. But I want you to appreciate that Rav Shlomo Alkabetz and Rav Yosef Karo, who were these two gedolim in terms of the world of Kabbalistic ideas, make aliyah to Israel, and they move to Tzfat. And it is Alkabetz who is writing such poetry like Licha Dodi. And if we analyze, when we get to analyzing Licha Dodi, you see this imagery of greeting the Shabbat queen, and particularly the idea of boi kala, of enter, the bride should enter. And this idea of being in a wedding ceremony plays very strong with the Kabbalists in terms of their writings. So we're going to see next time. I'm going to share with you a different poem or different Shabbat song that Rabbi Isaac Luria, otherwise known as the Arizal, who lived in Tzfat after Shlomo Alkabetz and Rav Yosef Karo, but he writes a particular song that is very much has this feeling of a wedding. This idea of Shabbat is the bride and we are the groom, and Shabbat is coming in, and so you'll see at least another parallel example of this imagery. And I think this may be a good starting point for us then to be able to analyze the text of Kabbalat Shabbat by seeing it through the prism of a wedding. That this may have been the understanding of those who instituted Kabbalat Shabbat, is that their reading of that Gemara may have been of a wedding, that we enter, the bride is entering in. And what do we do at weddings oftentimes? Under this, I'll end. What do we do at weddings? What is a large part of the wedding? What's happening in the background?
Sing, Bowie Chala, Bowie Chala.
Singing, dancing, music. This is a huge part of a wedding, even back then. That's not a new thing. And this idea of bringing in Shabbat with song and with dance, that may have been inspiring them in terms of how they read that Gemara. That's what it means to be Bowie Kala, Bowie Kala. It's like a wedding we're having right now. So we're going to talk more about this. We'll review this a little bit, and there's much more to talk about. I condensed and truncated that into about 20 minutes of, we'll review. Okay? Questions, comments?
Yeah, wasn't Matan Torah during Shavuos like also between the Kala and the Chassan?
Very good. Very good. I want to add two more things to what you just said, Adam. What do a lot of people have the custom of doing before Shabbat? Sephardim have particularly, I think, have this custom more strongly than Ashkenazim, though I think it appears in some Ashkenazi Sidurim. On Erev Shabbat,
Oh, Shirin?
Shir HaShirim. Excellent. What is Shir HaShirim if not this love between, a man and a woman? It's talking about, the relationship between a man and a woman. Whoa, where did that come from? That starts during this period, this idea of saying Shir HaShirim. What else do people say before? Another song that was composed at this time that we still say before Kabbalat Shabbat.
Yedid Nefesh.
Yedid Nefesh, which also talks about this idea of a relationship between the husband and wife, between a man and a woman, this beloved relationship between the two. You see, and that was written around that time. While it's not formally in Kabbalat Shabbat, that kind of a piyut, that kind of a poetry of does reflect this idea of between ourselves and God, a husband-wife type of relationship. So we're going to explore that wedding type of imagery as we study Kabbalat Shabbat. But we'll review this all next week also. If you didn't fully grasp that, it was fast, we'll review. I'm going to end the live feed on YouTube.
Are you doing